is now entering into the worst crisis of the 20th century. A crisis more deadly than that which built up around World War I and its aftermath, a crisis more deadly than that around World War II, its build-up and aftermath, and a crisis more deadly in some ways than the long-term threat of nuclear war between the two superpower blocs prior to the end of 1989. On the 16th of September, for example, we had a financial crisis with repercussions since, which show that we've entered a new phase of a worldwide depression, which in physical terms is far worse than the depression of the 1930s. In the meantime, we have the spread of war. You might say World War III has already begun. We have a spreading war in the Balkans. We have a war in Transcaucasus involving the Turkish population against the Armenians and the Georgians against the Abkhazians and so forth and so on. We have a war in Central Asia. We can say in general, World War III is spreading rapidly in the form of these local wars. It's like a forest fire threatening to engulf whole continents and perhaps the world as a whole. The U.S. misery is beyond belief, the physical misery, a homelessness of a type which has not existed in the United States in this century prevails. We have, coming out of the mouths of people like Clinton and Perot, proposals for so-called emergency action which are almost identical to the austerity proposals of Benito Mussolini and his Baccavolti di Misrata in Italy during the 1920s. Fascism is being presented as a remedy for the social unrest caused by depression. We have injustice in this country beyond belief. We are now talking at the Supreme Court level about the need to execute death row prisoners even if it is known that they are innocent of the crimes of which they're convicted. Murdering people for the sake of procedure, that's the philosophy. This is no longer America. How did this happen? Look at this statue for a moment. Let's go back to the time of the man this statue depicts, General Albert Pike. To understand why the United States is in such a mess today, why we not only have these troubles within our nation, but in our relations with the world at large. Why the people in Washington seem to be incapable either of recognizing the problem or proposing effective solutions. Why Clinton and Perot, as well as Bush, show not the slightest comprehension of what our problem is. We have to go back to the time of the Civil War, to the time of the man depicted by this statue. General Albert Pike, racist, traitor, and satanic degenerate. The fact that that statue has stood in Washington, D.C., near the Supreme Court, beside the Labor Department building, maintained on public land at public expense, shows that there is a pervasive corruption and ignorance inside our government, which is the cause for the continuation of our present problems. Let's go back to those events of the Civil War and trace it up to the present to see what the problem is and what we have to understand to solve the problem before us. What is called the U.S. Civil War, the most devastating war in our history, was not a war between the states. It was a civil war in the sense that a faction, including Bostonians such as Albert Pike, New Yorkers such as Slidell, and so forth, were all part of a British conspiracy run through the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which took over control of the states with the aid of a traitor at the head of the Democratic Party, August Belmont, a confessed traitor, in order to destroy the United States by dividing it into several parts so that the British might control it.
New York would cut loose from the puritanical East. She would open her magnificent port to the commerce of the world as an independent city-state.
This was not a Southern conspiracy. It was a conspiracy by British-controlled traitors to the United States to take over the Southern states, the slave-owning states, as a way of dividing the United States into several parts, which might be kept in perpetual conflict with each other, to eliminate the United States as both a factor in world politics and also to weaken it to the point that the image of the United States or the American Revolution might be erased from the memory and hopes of people around the world. For example, Albert Pike, as we said, the traitor whose statue is seen, was from Boston. Louisiana Slidell was a in-law of August Belmont, the traitor, from New York City. One of the worst of the traitors, Captain James Bullock, was the uncle and, for a considerable period of time, the political mentor of a president of the United States, his nephew, Teddy Roosevelt. The man who was president in 1901, the time that this statue was consecrated. In about 1853, Pike, a Bostonian, was sent down to the South by his fellow Bostonian, Caleb Cushing, also a member of the plot. By 1859, Pike had risen to the position of Supreme Commander of the Southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite, and thus the Supreme Commander of the forces of the Confederate conspiracy, which had now moved to take over the relevant states against the opposition of such patriots as Texas's Sam Houston, who was opposed to this conspiracy. Pike, as head of the Southern Freemasons, was not only the racist who later formed the Ku Klux Klan at the Nashville, Tennessee Maxwell House Hotel in 1867, Pike was also a Satanist. In his own words, as Pike wrote in Paris in 1889, Pike explained the religion of his Freemasonic cult as follows.
The true philosophical religion is the belief in Lucifer, the equal of Adonai.
Pike's Freemasonic plot had two subordinate arms. The first, founded in 1843 at Charlotte, South Carolina, was the B'nai B'rith. And the B'nai B'rith was not the representation of Jewish organizations in the United States. Quite the contrary. The majority of Jews in the United States were violently opposed to slavery in the tradition of the Passover Seder. And during the Civil War, fought or otherwise aided the Union in the cause of crushing slavery and maintaining the Union. The B'nai B'rith was founded as the pro-slavery racist faction among Jews. The B'nai B'rith of Freemasonry became the Confederate spy organization, later headed by Judah Benjamin, who was involved in the plot to kill Lincoln, among other things, and who worked very closely with Pike. In fact, Judah Benjamin played a key role, together with Pike, in founding the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee in 1867. The second subordinate organization of relevance of the southern jurisdiction of Freemasonry was what was the fighting arm of Freemasonry, which was known originally as the Knights of the Golden Circle, precursor of the Ku Klux Klan. These three elements, Pike's Freemasonic Lucifer-worshipping cult, B'nai B'rith, and the Ku Klux Klan, have been continuously interconnected from 1867 down through the present day. At the time Lincoln was inaugurated, the Confederacy went into open secession, open revolt. At that time, the enemies of the United States, the leading enemies of the United States, were Britain under the leadership of Lord Palmerston, who was otherwise known as the author of the Second and Third Opium Wars against China, and Palmerston's political catamite, the man that Palmerston, in fact, put into power in France, Napoleon III. In friends of the United States were Russia, the Russia of Tsar Alexander II, more specifically, and also the Meiji Restoration Forces in Japan, friends in Germany, and you might not know it, but it's significant, the King of Thailand. This alignment of friends and enemies became crucial in the course of the 20th century. By 1862, it became clear that once Lincoln had replaced more or less treasonous generals like General McClellan, the protege of August Belmont, who refused to win the Battle of Antietam, that the United States was organized in such a fashion that by its own means the Union would win the battle against the Confederacy, unless outside military interference occurred to prevent that from occurring. At that time, Lord Palmerston's Britain and France's Napoleon III agreed to deploy British and French naval forces to attempt to break the Union blockade of the Confederacy and thus enable France and Britain to reinforce the Confederacy, perhaps not to win the Civil War, but to make it so costly that the United States would bend to the will of the British government and accept a separate peace with the British Confederate puppet. At that point, Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, intervened. He prepared to send naval forces, which he did in 1863, to aid the United States. The Russian Navy arrived at New York City and San Francisco on friendship visits. And the commanders of these flotillas, these Russian flotillas, had sealed orders. In the event that Napoleon III or Britain or both should intervene against the Union to attempt to break the Union blockade or other actions, these sealed orders would be opened, and Russia would go to war against Britain and France in aid of its ally, the Union. At that point, Britain backed down, and the United States was able to settle its internal affairs by its own means. That began a worldwide movement under which the United States was implicitly the ally or the friend of Alexander II's Russia and of Germany against our deadly enemies, Britain and Napoleon III's France, until about the end of the century when things began to change. During that period, despite the assassination of Alexander II by forces friendly to Britain inside Russia, the policy of Alexander II was continued. A small group of the Russian nobility and others continued this admiration of the American system policy. At the same time, Witte, the leader of various governments of the Tsar, reached out to Germany and to France in the effort to get continental cooperation for a general development, economic development of all of Eurasia, based on cooperation initially in building railway lines which would extend from Brest in the coast of France through Paris to Vladivostok. And, of course, the Germans had a related policy of moving a rail line from Berlin to Baghdad. The British reacted with violence to this because they saw that the economic development of continental Eurasia meant an end to their dream of a worldwide, single, one-world British Empire. The idea that the United States, which had been traditionally, since Lincoln at least, had been allied with Russia, or at least that faction in Russia which Witte represented, and with the more positive forces in Germany, and forces around the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which in the 19th century were very close to the United States, and forces for independence, anti-British forces, such as those of Sun Yat-sen, for example, in China, that these forces united would mean an end to the British Empire, and the British had to break up that coalition. And thus we had in the 20th century, this upsurge of wars and revolutions, including World War I, which were entirely orchestrated by the British. The shooting, the execution of President William McKinley by admirers of Teddy Roosevelt from the Henry Street Settlement House not only brought Teddy Roosevelt to power, but effected fundamental changes in the internal and foreign policy of the United States. Instead of having as our friends and allies Germany, the faction of Alexander II and Witte in Russia, the Meiji Restoration forces in Japan, these became our enemies. And our former enemies in London and within France, the faction of Napoleon III, became our new allies. Against Russia, although we allied with Russia against Germany later, Teddy Roosevelt's friends in the grain cartel and elsewhere were active not only in supporting radical groups for the overthrow of the Tsar, but in collaborating with the government of Lenin and Trotsky in the earliest period to help build up the institutions of Bolshevik power and to enter into partnerships with the new Bolshevik powers. That was a big change. The domestic changes included the following. TR wanted to crack political opposition in the United States. And for this purpose, he wanted to create a national police force like that of Francis Napoleon III. He retained as his Attorney General that Charles Bonaparte was the nephew of Napoleon III, and he created a national police force called the National Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI. Later on, Roosevelt was crucial in collaboration with the backers of Woodrow Wilson, who was a like-minded scoundrel, in giving us two other institutions, the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Income Tax System. Without the collaboration between Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, these would never have occurred. And thus the United States was placed under the control of a debt system in which our national finance and banking was at the mercy of private interests to loot us almost as they will. This arrangement, a rearrangement of the political map, brought the United States into World War I, a war whose purpose was to further Britain's fear of continental economic development by playing one nation of the continent against one another in bloody war, even with a lot of British sacrifice thrown in to facilitate that, and to allow Britain to go on with the collaboration of its new junior partner, the United States, to establish a new one-world empire in the image of the Roman Empire. For that purpose, the victorious allies, the Anglo-Americans and their French political catamite partners, established the Treaty of Versailles and its institutions at the end of World War I, including the League of Nations, which was supposed to gradually put into place this new one-world empire. Well, that didn't work out too well. The Great Depression and other events intervened. As this carefully researched book documents the facts, in 1932, 1933, this British group and its friends in New York City put Adolf Hitler into power in Germany. Let's emphasize, Adolf Hitler did not come to power because the German people put him into power, but because the Anglo-American occupying powers which controlled Germany's finances put him into power. In point of fact, in 1932, an international conference on eugenics was held, sponsored by the mother of Averell Harriman and others, at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. This conference was addressed by Hitler's personal race theorist, Ernst Rüden. At the end of that conference, Ernst Rüden was elected unanimously president of the International Society for Eugenics. And Mrs. Harriman and others stated that they admired the Nazi Party because of those racial purification dogmas presented by Ernst Rüden. So they knew what they were doing. This led to war, World War II. There's no need to go into the details of that. The point is, during the last years of World War II, the Allies, Britain, the United States, and Moscow, set up a series of institutions constituting a new set of Versailles Agreements. Throughout the post-war period following World War II, the United States and Britain operated on the basis of what were called generically the Yalta Agreements. That is, despite the conflicts, including the threat of nuclear war, between the Soviet Empire and the Anglo-Americans throughout most of this period, at all times there was a back-channel relationship to such effect as Kissinger, for example, emphasized a number of times, that whenever Moscow, and together with London and Washington, would come to an agreement on world policy, the rest of the world had to obey. So there was a kind of a condominium, in effect, all through this period. That process came to an end, beginning late November 1989, when a sequence of events was unleashed, which led to the crumbling of the wall and led to the crumbling of what Churchill had called the Iron Curtain. The policy fight had begun even before the wall collapsed, or even before most people around the world knew it was going to collapse. Policy fight began with my address at the Kempinski Hotel on Columbus Day, October 12, 1988.
Under the proper conditions, many today will agree that the time has come for early steps toward the reunification of Germany, with the obvious prospect that Berlin might resume its role as the nation's capital.
A year later, the wall came down, at which time I introduced a program for a worldwide economic recovery, a program based on using the economic potential of Central Europe, a so-called economic productive triangle, to regenerate economic growth in Eurasia, very much along the lines which Count Witte had desired at the end of the last century and the early part of this century. Had that program been adopted, as many sympathize with it and were working to have it adopted, we would be in an economic recovery, not a depression today. Around Thatcher madmen, like Connor Cruz O'Brien and Nicholas Ridley, we began to hear the words of Fourth Reich and how Germany must be stopped from engaging in ventures in which German economic power, with or without France, might play a large role in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. In order to assist in stopping programs like the Triangle Program, which I had proposed from being implemented, friends of Kissinger, such as Britain's Lord Carrington or the State Department's Lawrence Eagleburger, unleashed their Serbian military puppets to enact genocide and other war crimes on other sections of the population of the former nation of Yugoslavia, thus creating a Balkan ulcer of war, which threatened to destroy Central Europe and much more within. For the same reason, the same geopolitical reason, that the British had orchestrated the creation of World War I, and that Anglo-Americans, by putting Hitler into power in Germany, had created the preconditions of World War II, these madmen, typified by Kissinger cronies, Carrington and Eagleburger, With their Balkan adventures, we're back to World War I drafting boards, starting another world war of little wars in Transcaucasus, the Balkans, Central Asia, and elsewhere, with potential nuclear implications spreading and spreading throughout the world until the whole world itself, under conditions of depression, might be engulfed in war. The worst depression of this century is in full swing. We have spreading wars in the Balkans, Transcaucasus, Central Asia, and we're at the verge of movement to a change of government, which might be a hardline development around Moscow in the very near future. This all is the result of a horrible mismanagement of the post-1989 period by U.S. and British government, chiefly. Thus, the legacy of this statue of racist, treasonous, satanic Albert Pike still influences the domestic and foreign policy shaping of Washington, D.C. If we do not root out of our republic the treason, the corruption, the degeneracy which Albert Pike and his collaborators and followers represent, there is no chance that the United States will prevail as a nation, either in its domestic affairs or its foreign affairs. Unless we act now to reject all lesser evils which compromise with what this statue symbolizes, there is no hope that the United States will escape the kind of hell which world famine, world disease, spreading war, and economic depression generally portend.
And it is our duty, according to the founders of the Declaration of Independence, it is our duty to pull it down. It is our duty to remove it.